Right. Well, welcome. It's good to see you here, Jamie. I'll give you a brief introduction. I think most folks are pretty well acquainted with you, given your service here in Massachusetts very recently. But let me tell folks that you are currently the Policy Director of the Future of Heat Initiative. And I think we all know and have appreciated your services as chair of our own DPU from 2023 to just October 2025, fairly recently. Before that, Jamie was professor of law and director of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development at the West Virginia University College of Law. And even before that, he was executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center in White Plains, New York. He has extensive training and experience in environmental law and regulation, and is the author of an interesting book, How West Virginia Was Left Behind in the Clean Energy Revolution. Okay, so welcome, Jamie. Why don't we begin by having you tell us a little bit about your organization, the Future of Heat Initiative, what you guys are up to, and what you're hoping to accomplish.
Sure. Thanks, Roger, and thanks for the opportunity to appear in front of this group. I see a couple familiar faces. Ed and Toby Wall were very good friends of Elizabeth and me when we were in Boston. It's really nice to see Ed and Toby here. Um, it's also good to see some folks from Boston and the mothers out front. So Future of Heat Initiative, it's been around maybe 18 months. It was started by, I don't know if you know, Bruce Bewald, who was the founder and CEO of Synapse Energy Economics there in Cambridge, and then Mike Bloomberg, who was founder of Groundwork Data, which works with Mike Walsh and Dory Seavey on basically natural gas transition issues, underground, pipes and all that. Um, and basically, what we do is we work directly with commissions and their staffs around the country. This is a great fit for me because I think, as we're going to talk about today, I think one of the issues on which I had the greatest impact when I was at the DPU was on this gas transition. And I think Massachusetts can lay claim to being the number one state in the country in terms of the gas transition. There are a lot of other states at different stages on that path of looking at the gas transition. States have started future of gas proceedings like we did in Massachusetts in 2020. And so we work directly with the commissioners and their staffs. We do not intervene in rate cases. We don't file expert testimony. Um, we work literally directly with the commissioners because these are very challenging issues. I think we've learned some things in Massachusetts. I learned some things in Massachusetts I learned from other states when I was in the job at the DPU, and it's just helpful for us all to exchange information and lessons learned and the very challenging issues in the natural gas transition. So it's fun to be part of this organization.
Great. It's good to hear that so folks at the national level working on this. I think many of us are familiar with that recent publication you put out, Paying More for Less, the Rising Gas Bills in Massachusetts. And I think you're intending to actually produce a similar documentation for other states and starting with Illinois and others. Is that right?
Yeah, we're issuing these, we call them affordability primers, but basically we've got probably a dozen that we're going to issue over the next month. We issued Illinois last week. New York, California are coming up. But it's basically taken the same sort of analysis that we did for Massachusetts, that's looking at, what is driving up the cost of your gas bill and across the country. It's the gas delivery charges. It's the fact that the gas companies continue to spend more and more money on infrastructure. So even though the amount of gas that's actually delivered is going down, and very much so in Massachusetts, given the transition to electric heat pumps, if we don't get the spending down on the infrastructure, then you just do the simple math. If you have less throughput going through the pipe and rising infrastructure costs, that's just going to lead to higher bills. And so what we're doing at the Future of Heat Initiative is really letting regulators know. Some of the states have figured it out. A lot of the states haven't figured out. This is a serious issue coming up because this transition is definitely underway given the technological advances of electric heat pumps. So more and more people are going to be moving off gas. And you've got to basically, the message is we have to shrink the system to correspond with that reduction in gas usage. Otherwise, it's just simple math. The rates are going to go ever higher.
Right, right. And I did put a link in the chat to that document for folks who haven't looked at it, Paying More for Less. Really lots of interesting data there. And what just to cover, aside from what you've already said, other key points that you make in that document that you'd like people to know about why we're paying more for less.
I mean, it's a challenge because the gas distribution company, I refer to them as the LDCs, the local distribution companies. It's all about safety, and you can't deny, and it's certainly we're with the DPU. We want to make it sure as long as there's gas going through the pipes, we need to make sure that the system is safe. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we can overinvest in a system. There's smarter ways of doing things, and one of the things that we did in the recent round of GSEP orders that the DPU issued last April was, force the LDCs to really take a close look at relining and repair as an alternative to replacement because they tend to just default to replacement. That gets very, very expensive. Those pipes stay in the ground 50, 60, 70 years. And maybe we only need to do relining and repair to get us another 10 or 15 years. So that pipe can be decommissioned in favor of electrification. But just getting a handle on the spending, because at the DPU regulators, we don't have any control over the price of natural gas, the commodity, which is set in competitive markets. We do have control over the delivery charges and trying to manage those costs. And certainly the GSEP costs were very, very high. And I think the DPU issued a kind of a reset order last April that I think will put the LDCs on a path to start reducing those GSEP charges, and also I think look more towards non-pipeline alternatives, electrification, network geothermal, just avoiding additional investment in natural gas infrastructure. And that's, if you want to spend the money that way, that's a much better way to spend the money. There's no question we have leak-prone pipes that need to be addressed. Massachusetts has a very old system, but we can't continue to operate on the assumption that the gas system is going to remain in place in perpetuity. And that's really what the LDCs will say, well, we need to replace it because if we were relying on a repair, we're only going to delay the inevitable replacement. And that's just not the way to think about it because we're looking at just getting maybe another 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And maybe relying on repair is a lower cost solution for customers that are going to help keep rates down.
Right, right. And you're probably aware of the recent report from the utilities on how well they did. That looking at non-pipeline alternatives suggests that they're not exactly on board with the DPO Order 2080 at this point. What do you see the challenges in getting our utilities to actually cooperate and do what they need to do?
Well, they fundamentally they see it as a existential threat to their business model, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
and it's obviously much more challenging for a standalone um, gas company. And Massachusetts, we have a couple of them, Liberty and Berkshire, but the other three are EverSource, National Grid, and Unitil. They're combination utilities. It's a much easier road ahead for a combination utility if you can just kind of sell more electricity and sell less gas. Um, but when you're a standalone LDC, you're literally going to be fighting for your life, and I think that's one of the reasons they're digging in. I mean, when we issued the 2080 order back in December of 2023, one of the things I made it clear was that, we'd really like to have the gas companies at the table. These are very complicated issues. It's about maintaining the financial viability of these companies. It's about being able to continue to attract and retain good workforce and it's easier to solve the problems when we have the gas companies at the table. And I was disappointed that we didn't have more sort of cooperation because I represented investor-owned utilities for 22 years. I get it. I recognize the need to raise capital on reasonable terms, which is good for ratepayers and shareholders. But there are solutions to engaging in this transition, but still not compromising your profitability on the way. I mean, in many respects, it kind of reminded me, as Roger mentioned, I wrote the book called The Coal Trap, How West Virginia Was Left Behind the Clean Energy Revolution. And one of the themes out of that book was the coal industry just sort of sticking their head in the sand and saying, it's all about Obama's job-killing EPA. It's the war on coal. It's not really a recognition that with fracking and cheaper solar and wind technologies, life is over for new coal plants. And instead, they just kept not really coming to the table and not really engaging in any research and development. I worry that the gas companies, at least in Massachusetts, are kind of going down the same path. We're just going to ride this out as long as we possibly can and not engage and not help solve the problem. But
Hmm.
we'll see. It's
Yeah.
like I say, they're challenging issues.
Right. One of our members submitted a question I think I sent to you about that we have these companies that have a gas side and an electric side. I think I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that somehow there is a formal separation of the two. It seems so logical that if they were truly fully integrated, you're just raising your profit in electricity, dropping it on gas. It should be simple, but it sounds like it's more challenging than that.
It is more challenging because they literally do operate as separate divisions. I mean, some of the early um, proceedings that we've had implementing the 2080 order, the concept is integrated energy planning, where the gas company and the electric company work together. Because what you need to do, if you can identify opportunities to decommission pipe because of, a lot of leak-prone pipe, and you can identify a section that could potentially be decommissioned, then you got to go to the electric company and make sure the electric company has the capacity to take on that additional load. So you have to have the overlay of the maps. And so you got to have the gas company, electric company working together. And what we found was even within the same utility, they just don't talk to each other. It's completely separate in terms of how they plan. We're breaking that down. And one of the things I did while I was at the DPU, we created a new division, the Resilience Engineering and Clean Energy Division. And one of the things that new division is going to do is this integrated energy planning piece, because we have a gas division, we have electric division, but we need to have a division that's going to work with the utilities to figure out how we do this integrated planning, because that's the way you keep costs down longer term. You got to think about, you're delivering energy, and what is the cheapest form of energy and how best to deliver it, and we need to be working together. That's really fundamental to keeping the cost down and keeping the rates down for customers.
Right, right. So in terms of keeping costs down, they're on the table in New York and here now are new gas pipelines. The notion being that we're at the end of a pipeline, and that's part of the reason that gas is so expensive here. Do you have any notion about the supply side, whether that's really an issue at all, and if we need a new gas pipeline to do something about that?
I'm probably going to stay away from that one.
Okay.
Roger. That's at a high level. I think, um, certainly Governor Hochul in New York is under a lot of pressure. I think probably the same thing is applying to Governor Hewitt. The gas folks will tell us, "Oh, you just need more gas pipelines." And I think, Massachusetts went down a different path. It says, "No, we're going to decarbonize, and our future is offshore wind." That's where those zero carbon electrons are going to be coming from. Um, I can say I don't think we need any additional gas capacity for the local gas distribution companies, because I think, if we follow the path of 2080 and we get to net zero by 2050, like the Global Warming Solutions Act
Right.
requires, I don't think we need additional gas for buildings, basically.
Okay. Okay.
For electric generation, that's not within
Sure.
the purview of the DPU, but that's the argument that's being made, is that electricity prices could be lower given the amount of electricity that's generated with natural gas. Wouldn't more capacity potentially result in
Mhm.
lower electricity prices? Um, could be. I mean, I liked the path that Massachusetts is on in terms of, the great thing about wind and solar, it has zero fuel cost, and you avoid the exposure to volatile and high fossil fuel prices. And as long as we keep relying on natural gas to generate electricity, we're not going to get away from that. But the DPU, we really weren't involved in the bigger picture resource acquisitions. DOER does that, Department of Energy Resources. A lot of it's done through ISO New England, through the capacity markets. But there's certainly a lot of interest in, yeah, we need
Right.
more
Right.
pipeline capacity.
Yeah.
And, we don't need it for the gas distribution system.
Right. Okay. No, that's very helpful. I appreciate your response on that, and I need to stay away from some thorny issues. But let's stick a little bit with the challenges of decommissioning the gas system over time, something that the DPU Order 2080 really addresses in some detail. We've talked about the difficulty of working with the gas utilities and coordinating that with the electric utilities. That's clearly clearly an issue that we face. What about this notion of, we have this experiment in Framingham, the pilot project that kind of was a little bit went over estimated at cost and was quite expensive, and got about 80% of residents to kind of sign up for this. So we still have a gas system that's kind of running into that area, and we're not entirely sure that we're going to be able to afford geothermal. How are we going to get residents in areas where there might be an opportunity to actually cut them off from the gas system and move on to something else? How are we going to deal with that issue, getting the cooperation we need and being able to afford to manage that transition?
That's a huge challenge, Roger. And in
Yeah.
terms of sort of being disappointed at the gas utilities sort of not coming to the table. And then this raises the whole issue of obligation to serve, or
Right.
more accurately, the continuing obligation to serve existing customers. Because what we've seen, if you look at the NPA, the non-pipeline alternatives analysis, the preliminary analysis they filed in their climate compliance plans, it's all about customer choice.
Right.
And if the customer chooses that they want to keep their gas, I mean, that really ends the analysis as far as what they're saying in their NPA framework, is we can identify opportunities based on hydraulics, based on the presence of leak-prone pipe. You're at the end of the system. You're not going to affect the deliverability of gas to downstream customers. And so maybe you identify 30 customers in a subdivision, and 28 say, yeah, we're in, and two say, yeah, we like our gas and we're not going to give it up. Then the LDCs, the gas companies will just say, end of discussion. There is no decommissioning opportunity here because not everybody is on board. And if everybody isn't on board, then you can't decommission the pipe.
Mhm.
And I think that's also present in the case of, National Grid has filed the electrification demonstration project involving the towns of Leominster and Winthrop, 118 customers, 14 different segments. This is currently in front of the DPU at various, it's still in the kind of sort of the evidence gathering process. But, what National Grid will say, if we can't find on any of those 14 segments, 100% of the customers on those segments that agree to decarbonize and electrify, then there will be no decommissioning. So that's the crux of it in terms
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
that holdout customer. And what, the 2024 climate bill got a lot of good stuff in there that I think really helps make the case for the DPU having the authority to substitute electric for natural gas.
Right.
And the commission teed that up in the climate compliance plan dockets, that said, do you think, given the changes that were made in the 2024 climate bill, do you think the DPU has the authority to substitute electric for gas in the context of a decommissioning proposal? And that's going to be in front of the commission. And other states are wrestling with it as well. New York's tried to pass a couple of times, addressing that obligation to serve. Massachusetts, it's a little bit easier case to make because the obligation to serve is actually electricity or gas. So it's fuel neutral. So a stronger case can be made that if you can substitute electric for gas and you can have the same essential utility services provided by electric as gas, then you should be able to make that substitution. But that's where it stands in terms
Mhm.
of,
Right.
the LDCs are really standing behind. It's all about customer choice. I think one of the things the DPU raised in that hearing officer memo, well, what about the 28 customers in that subdivision who do want to electrify? What about their choice? Why do we only focus on the choice of the customers who want to keep their gas? Why do those two holdouts get to basically override the preferences of the 28 customers who do want to electrify? So it's not that easy to just say, oh, it's all about customer choice.
Yeah.
And then with this, it's the same thing in terms of the broader public interest.
Right.
And I think one of the things we said in the 2080 order, and it was also covered, I think, in that hearing officer memo, is it's the difference between a managed transition and an unmanaged transition. With an unmanaged transition, which is pretty much what we have now, those customers who can afford to get off gas and get those electric heat pumps, they're going to leave the system. And if those fixed costs don't go down, then the
Yeah.
remaining customers, typically low to moderate income customers, are going to be left with the higher bills associated with that. So the importance is to manage the transition, which means As that throughput goes down, you've got to shrink the system correspondingly. Otherwise, those delivery charges are going to keep going up. So without addressing the obligation to serve, it's really hard to achieve that managed transition. But that's an essential component of being able to make that substitution and take that broader public interest into account, the need of the Commonwealth to achieve its climate goals, avoid its stranding costs, reducing greenhouse gases,
Sure.
all those things are part of it. But it's a challenge, and that's one of the things that, at the Future of Heat Initiative, we're going to be working on these electrification demonstration projects to try to roll out so kind of a template that other states can adopt. California adopted a bill that allows SB 1221 that allows if two-thirds of the customers agree to electrify, then you can basically override the one-third who don't. So they're in the process of implementing that, but that's one state that actually was able to pass a statute that addresses that obligation to serve in a way that looks at that broader public interest. And if the vast majority of the customers want to electrify, then the opponent shouldn't be able to stop that decommissioning from happening.
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like at this time, the DPU tentatively has some authority to do this, but there's still some legal challenges pending on that, and we need some stronger legislation that would make that happen. Give DPU the
Yeah,
total authority to do this.
Senator Barrett took a shot at that. The outcome of when I first got there in May of 2023, we had this GSEP working group, the Gas System Enhancement Plan working group. And that was one of the recommendations that was made to the legislature at the end of that process was basically giving the DPU the authority to authorize that decommissioning and authorize that substitution of electric for gas in the context of a decommissioning proposal. And that went to the legislature and it did not pass the legislature. So some of the recommendations of the GSEP working group did, others didn't. Some of them the DPU picked up in those orders from last April in the GSEP dockets. For example, the phasing out of the reducing the revenue cap for the GSEP charges. But other pieces of those recommendations did not make it through, and that's probably the one that's the most controversial for the gas companies and for the labor unions and the home builders. Those tend to be the folks who really are fighting hard for that what they call customer choice.
Right, right. And the other piece of this is, of course, the finances and the cost to consumers of making the transition. Do you envision that is something that we can manage if we can figure out how to support folks who need financial help to make the transition to a heat pump, or is the geothermal network going to be the way to go in the future? Do you have thoughts about how to afford this?
Geothermal network, I think that's part of the solution. I think the results of Framingham were generally very encouraging. Obviously it's higher cost than you'd want to do on a going forward basis, but I think the early results from the data that's being gathered by Heat and EverSource, I think that it's been a really exceptionally good outcome. From the regulator's perspective, it's all about costs. Is this a reasonable cost? And it's a demonstration project. Almost by definition, it's going to be higher cost. You look at, well, where can we reduce those costs? One of the drivers is just the cost of drilling the boreholes, because frankly, there are not enough folks out there doing it. So if National Grid or EverSource wants to issue an RFP, a request for proposals to have boreholes drilled, they don't get a lot of takers.
Uh-huh.
And if, if,
Right.
if, you- if you're going to scale that up, you would say, well, if a gas company is going to transform itself into a thermal company, it's going to have its own drilling rig and its own team of drillers. And so you try to figure out where you can bring down those costs if you scale things up. And I think
Right.
there's some good lessons learned from
Right.
Framingham. So I think network geothermal's part of the solution. I think the governor's affordability bill has a lot of good elements to try to address those upfront costs. Can we have the utilities actually being in the business of drilling the boreholes and providing the service of thermal heat? Is there a securitization part of that? Because there's a lot of interest. Network geothermal has tremendous advantages, and ground source heat pumps generally tremendous advantages in terms of their efficiency is so much better than air source heat pumps, which means on the electric side, you have to build less T&D infrastructure because those peaks are going to be lower. There are a lot of big advantages of network geothermal over air source heat pumps, and but even individual ground source heat pumps is a possibility too. But it's all a matter of scaling it up. Can we get those costs down? And
Right.
it's always a struggle. Who's gonna pay for this? Obviously, we have the issue with the most recent 3-year program of Mass Save and what that budget looks like and where that burden falls, and are there better ways of financing Mass Save? The governor's affordability bill addresses that.
Hmm.
Can should taxpayers be bearing some of those costs? I mean, we consistently have a conversation with the legislature now, with the DPU is like, why can't we put some of this on the taxpayers? And they're always like, no, we're going to recover it through utility rate. But that's obviously there are other sources
Yeah.
of revenues. Then can we try to get away from recovering that through utility rates? Because it's all about affordability and keeping utility bills down.
Right, right. You mentioned something about securitization, and I think a number of us are sort of curious about how that works. I think that we don't have too many people with PhDs in economics here to
Yeah.
really understand that. I hear there's some criticism of that approach and some concerns about that approach, but obviously the governor is very supportive of it. I mean, are you familiar with how that might work and what we could achieve through that process?
Yeah, I'm very familiar. I've been around long enough. The very first utility in the country to use securitization to finance energy efficiency measures was my client, Puget Sound Energy in Seattle, Washington, in the mid 1990s. And my law firm basically wrote the legislation in Washington. But what it allows you to do is finance at a lower cost. Basically, you create it's almost like a bucket of expenditures or bucket of spending, and you dedicate like the first batch of revenues that comes in the door goes to pay off those bonds.
Mhm.
And so the rating agencies can say, instead of getting a triple B plus rating or a triple B, you're actually going to get an A or an A minus because you've created so this special category, so a preference on the revenues that come in the door go to pay off those bonds first, and that gives the rating agency the ability to say we're going to give this an A rating. So instead of financing at 6%, it's going to be 3.5%. I mean, that's basically the way it
Right.
works. And one of the things we kicked around, with the governor's affordability bill is, well, maybe we can finance a portion of Mass Save that way. When you look at the useful life of some of the energy efficiency investments like heat pumps that last 10, 15 years, shouldn't we be financing that over the period over which those benefits are
Mhm.
delivered to customers rather than paying for it through operating expenses? So
Mhm.
Melissa Lavinson and her Office of Energy Transformation Working Group, which is looking at some of these financing this transition, and working with the folks at the analysis group that ran a lot of different scenarios, shows, if you took a portion of that Mass Save budget and securitized it and basically spread the repayment to match the period over which those assets are delivering benefits to consumers, it's much cheaper. And rather than paying for it as currently through operating expenses, it's just the
Mhm.
rate impacts are much, much
Right.
lower.
Right.
And you can do the same thing with transmission and distribution infrastructure investments. It's just the utilities, that's where they make their money. I mean,
Right.
part of the issue is the rate making model that um, the more investment they can put in that rate base, which is one of the things that drives the GSEP investment and the replacement of pipes, the more profits they earn because they earn a return on each dollar that they
Right.
put in that rate base. So if you take
Yep.
away, instead of the weighted average cost of capital, which is 50% equity for the most part, you're taking that out and you're saying, yeah, instead of a weighted average cost of capital of about 7.5%, we're going to securitize it at 3.5%. And you don't earn any profits on that at all because it's 100% financed with debt and no equity. The utilities are going to fight back on that with respect to transmission and distribution infrastructure on the electric side. But for Mass Save, for example, which is financed through it's 1.5 billion a year. It's 4.5 billion over 3 years,
Right.
recovered through current rates rather than spreading that out over a period that corresponds with the benefits that those assets deliver to customers. So it's a nice tool if used judiciously. I
Mhm.
think, we can't overuse it because you're creating a special category of spending, and the more those categories that you create, then you have less and less of the regular obligations that are
Yeah,
covered with normal bonds. But it's definitely a tool, and
yeah,
that's what happened to my client Puget Sound Energy. I mean, we used to basically capitalize those energy efficiency investments and put them into rate base, and all of a sudden you've got about $800 million of investment that's in your rate base that's based on the regulators promise that you're going to be able to recover those costs in rates, and the financial community says, that looks risky to us. And so Puget Sound Energy had to come up with a solution. They said, well, let's take that out and refinance that with securitization. So it's nice to see now it caught all this attention. You look at the history of securitization transactions, and Puget Sound Energy is the top of the list in the mid 90s.
yeah. Yeah, no, that was the most cogent explanation of securitization I have heard to date. Thank you. One quick follow-up on that, though. So the issue it does strike me that if we could securitize more of the capital investment in actual infrastructure, what you're doing is you're cutting into the profits of the
Exactly.
investors in the utilities. Now, aside from the fact that they like to make money, is there a problem with getting investors out of this business? We'll be becoming like more of a public utility if we financed everything through bonds. Do you see any future for that, or is it just really kind of an intractable conflict between the utilities and the concept?
I mean, as long as you're issuing some stock, I mean, these are investor-owned utilities. I mean, I think it's just a matter of what part of that portfolio could you potentially finance through securitization, finance with 100% debt, and then it's striking that balance. But there will be opposition from the utilities if you try to
Yeah,
take T&D investment. But I think another thing we're working on, it's not really the primary focus of the Future Feed Initiative, but some of this is just the basic rate making model. We have an article coming out in a couple months that the research director at the Future Feed Initiative has been working on, that kind of looks at these rate making statutes. For the most part, the rate making statutes were enacted between 1900 and 1910.
yeah,
And is that still the model that works well for us in terms of, we call it the CapEx bias, the capital expenditure bias, but the fact that an electric company is going to want to put more T&D infrastructure, transmission distribution infrastructure, rather than looking at virtual power plants and using that battery in your car as a virtual power plant on your side of the meter, or distributed solar, the things that the customers can do to manage their energy usage. That are operating expenses, right? That the utility recovers. If they're going to give you incentives for doing that, that's an operating expense. They don't make any money on operating expenses. Those are just passed through dollar for dollar.
sure,
There's a bias that says, no, we like to build stuff and put it into rate base. It's what drives the
right,
GSEP programs on the gas side. We want to keep, and that's what's created this problem.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
is there a different way to set rates that we should be looking at? And our rates of return generally too high. There's a lot of discussion on that right now that says that all utilities across the country are tending to make the profit level is too high. I think we did a good job of bringing it down a little bit while I was
Mhm.
on the DPU. Another piece is, how much of that should be financed with debt versus equity? Because
Right.
right
Yeah.
now it's pretty much 50-50. And most unregulated businesses do not finance their capital with 50% debt and 50% equity. It's more leverage, which is cheaper for customers. So there's a lot of things that it's like this affordability crisis, I think, really does create some opportunities to have a fundamental examination of how we've been doing things in setting rates. Is there a better way that's gonna basically align the incentives that we're trying to accomplish in terms of clean energy, but also keep rates down for customers? I think to some extent the evidence suggests that the existing model is not working very well.
Yeah, I got you. But we're going to leave a lot of time for questions here. But I just there's one question from a member that wanted to ask that, we're getting ready to draft a new clean energy and climate plan for Massachusetts for 2035. We have in place one that was drafted for 2030, and I think you're probably aware that one recommendation that came out of their cost effectiveness analysis was that if we went with hybrid heat pump systems, if we kept the fossil fuel as backup in those systems, that this was going to be a more economical way to kind of move us towards our goal of net zero by 2050 until maybe, keep doing that until 2030. And in the DPU 2080 order, you all, I think, moved away from that. And I think one of our members at least was curious about, well, doesn't the CECP supposed to guide what we do? And then you guys had a different interpretation.
I mean, I think one of the things we're looking at in 2080 is, I get that, and there are a lot of, Harvey Michaels at MIT. I spent have many conversations with him, um, who supports this notion of we should keep those natural gas furnaces in place to basically deal with the peaks in electric usage, when in really, really cold days. And we're all going to be better off for doing that. It's going to be a while before we can transition the whole gas system. So in the meantime, let's just keep those furnaces in place. I get that. Um, I think we're also looking at, you know, if people have this hybrid electrification where they have the backup furnace, then what does that do? That has a very few days of the year when that pipe is going to be used. It really makes the economics much, much harder for the gas companies and for those delivery charges, because you're trying to recover those fixed costs of maintaining that system. And now your throughput has gone way down because instead of using that natural gas furnace the entire winter. You're only going to use it a few days. So the throughput goes down. You can't decommission any pipes because there's still therms going through it to serve that furnace those 2 or 3 or 4 days of the year. So that's a big component of it is, and then I think the technology of cold climate heat pumps continues to improve. And I think one of the things that we landed on was, um, do we, I think a lot of it depends on individual circumstance, right? How
Yeah,
well your house is insulated, and all
yeah,
those
yeah, yeah, yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But I think the presumption should be you don't need that gas furnace as a backup because it makes the transition that much harder because we really need to figure out a way to start decommissioning the
Right.
pipe as the throughput goes down, and that goes in the
Yeah,
in the wrong direction. You're having to maintain pipe
yeah,
for less and less throughput, and those economics just don't work
yeah.
for the customer is going to be left on the system.
No, no, I got it. And I think, we hear from folks who have put in the cold climate heat pumps that getting through even some of our coldest days has worked out. So as a heat pump coach, I definitely recommend in most cases that folks actually go without the backup. So we've got time now for some questions. I guess what I would like folks to do is to raise their hand and to ask their question live if they can. We'll have some folks, maybe Tina and some others can go through the chat to see if some questions emerge there too. But are there questions for Jamie that people would like to ask at this time?
So Roy Harvey has his hand up, Roger.
Okay, all right. Roy, you want to unmute yourself, Roy?
Yes, yes. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Van Nostrand, for the information today. My question is on the electric system and the advanced metering infrastructure that's being deployed over the next year or two. I wonder what kind of features and functions you think that will be able to support, and in particular, will it be able to do retail demand response, which a recent Berkeley Labs study found needs 1 minute resolution, that each meter had to report back once a minute. But what are your takes on what we could expect from a demand response rate, and what should we as environmental advocates be advocating for?
That's a great question, and it's one of the things, that decision for advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, and the smart meters, that was made before I got here in terms of the rollout. Eversource and National Grid are each doing it over a 3-year period. That's slightly offset. One of the critical pieces is customers have to be able to benefit. The benefits for customers need to exceed those costs. And a lot of commissions around the country, when AMI, advanced metering infrastructure, was first being proposed, they said, well, we're skeptical that the benefits are going to exceed the costs. In other words, giving customers those additional price signals, their ability to respond to that, the ability to manage their peaks. If they do a good job of managing your peaks, then the utilities have to build less stuff, which is good, which is how customers potentially benefit. And and so that means all this technology needs to work together. And I call it digitalization. But it's basically to your question, it's now we have the AMI and the smart meters. Will it have that capability to allow customers, to manage their energy use in a more effective manner? And AI, and everybody's heard way too much about AI. It's such a artificial intelligence, such a hot topic, but there could be a role for AI there in terms of, we're going to be because what goes along with smart meters is the DPU will be rolling out time varying rates, right? To be able to send that signal to charge your car in the middle of the night and instead of plugging it in when you get home. Um, but customers, so we're going to be really focusing on sending those price signals to customers through time varying rates, but then the customers have to be able to respond. And that's where all this technology needs to work together. So there's some really good folks at the Electric Power Division at the DPU. They're looking at this is what I said is we need to make sure that the utilities are taking advantage of the latest technology so that customers can receive those benefits because that's how we keep the cost down of this clean energy transition is I call it increasing the asset utilization ratios, right? The more stuff that we put on the ground, the T&D infrastructure, because we're going to be basically delivering a lot more electrons. We're going to decarbonize transportation. We're going to decarbonize buildings. So more electrons doesn't necessarily need to increase costs. It actually means you're going to have more electrons if we don't have to build too much stuff. But if utilities don't manage this wisely and don't take advantage of technology, then utilities are going to overbuild and it will be more expensive than it needs to be. So that's really the burden of regulators is making sure they're not building more than they have to, even though that's the profit motive that our rate making mechanism gives them is to keep building more stuff. But the regulators, we need to be ever vigilant to make sure they're not building more than they have to. They're taking advantage of technology so that customers can do things to manage their peak, which puts less load on the grid and therefore keeps costs down. So it's and the other thing is that's challenging. It's moving so rapidly in terms of this technology. So the decisions that the utility might have made a few years ago constantly need to be revisited. Are we making sure that all these things work together? There's a guy in Cambridge in the same building as Synapse. Mike Phillips runs a company called Sense, and he's got an app basically that will do all these things seamlessly. You don't know that it's going on, but it's managing all those things in your house to manage your bills. But that app needs to work with the smart meter and the AMI that National Grid and Eversource is installing. So it's things like that. That's the whole digitalization issue. Because customers, we may be sending those prices. Customers may say, I don't really want to screw around with figuring out when I'm going to run my appliances or when I'm going to plug my car in or what setting my heat pump is at. But if you have an app that says all this is going to happen without you even knowing about it, we're going to manage your energy usage in a manner that reduces your bills, and you don't need to do anything. I mean, that's where AI potentially has a role, and apps like what Sense came up with. But the job as regulators is making sure that all this investment that we're making in advanced metering infrastructure and smart meters is going to work together to enable that technology to produce benefits for customers.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate that.
Sorry for the long-winded answer. It's complicated. It's fun though, I think.
Okay, Jonathan, and then Tina's up after that.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. This is very, very interesting. What about the prospects of going, moving, perhaps to building up the new municipally owned utilities, of moving towards a public utility system in Massachusetts uh, that's not plagued by the fragmented, privately owned, profit-oriented utility system? Because long term, we're always going to have the same problem with the profit being more important than what actually is best for the public interest, unless over time we were to if we were to go to a public utility system model like in Canada. What's your thoughts on that?
It's, I mean, I practiced law for 22 years in the Northwest. Oregon and Washington are almost evenly split with investor-owned utilities versus consumer-owned utilities, like Seattle City Light, Tacoma City Light, are consumer-owned utilities, lots of public utility districts. There are obviously advantages of consumer-owned ownership model. You don't have the shareholders, right? So a lot of the things that make it more complicated from a public policy perspective, because of making sure that earnings are maintained for the benefit of shareholders. A lot of those problems drop away. One can argue that your decision-making process is more localized because you have a PUD in the state of Washington. You're going to have three commissioners who are elected by the public. There are a lot of, advantages. Just, that's a big picture issue that's way over, way out of my the purview of your retail regulator. Those decisions made by policymakers at the state level, even I guess at the state level primarily. But obviously, towns have the ability, if they want to basically use eminent domain to condemn poles and wires and create their own municipal-owned utilities. I mean, there are really, really well-run consumer-owned utilities. There are really, really badly run consumer-owned utilities. And the same thing can be said of investor-owned utilities. So, but it's just, it's sort of the model that we landed on in the United States in terms of primarily a capitalist system, and the jobs of the regulators is to strike that balance between making sure that rates are high enough to provide reasonable profits for shareholders, but reasonable priced for consumers. And so that's the job of the regulators. But yeah, that's certainly those are options. I don't know if it's getting more traction now or not, but I can say there are definite advantages. Having worked out in the Northwest with some of those non-investor-owned utility clients, and seeing some of the things you can do that's in the customer's interest, that you just don't have to step back from in light of, and energy efficiency is a good example of that, right? Because you want to help customers save bills, but you have to maintain the profit levels to keep the shareholders happy. There are a lot of things that are easier when you have a consumer-owned utility. But that's a really fundamental question in terms of how business is organized in the United States, and it's kind of theoretical. From the regulator's point of view, we're kind of it's above our pay grade.
All right, I hear you. Tina.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie Van Nostrum, and thank you for all the good work you did here in Massachusetts when you were at the DPU. In the 1920s, my mother-in-law worked as an electricity girl up in far upstate New York when the Niagara Mohawk Company came into existence, when they dammed up the rivers and started electricity. And she would go out into the countryside where people had no electricity to try and educate them about using electric washing machines, electric stoves,
Yep.
and get rid of their ice chests, etc. I think we need some more electricity salespeople here. Your modeling of the phone app for digitalization, do you think Massachusetts should invest in some real marketing for these kinds of materials and education for customers?
Education is going to be a big deal when time varying rates gets rolled out, and it's really going to be primarily up to the utilities, but with the close oversight of the DPU, I presume. But that's in those states that have time varying rates in place. You've really got to educate customers and again, it goes back to the benefits need to exceed the cost. In order for the customers to be able to get the benefits, they need to be in a position to understand the variance in their rates, the time varying rates, and to be able to modify their behavior. For example, go ahead and plug in your EV when you get home, but have a smart charger that's going to know how to charge that EV at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when wholesale power prices are really low. But it's customer education. And the utilities are really, like I said, they're going to be on the front lines of that. But that's, because those states that have already rolled out time varying rates, and there are quite a few of them, that's one of the lessons, the kind of the takeaways is just the amount of the customer engagement that needs to be done in order to make it work.
Yeah, and I assume it's a generational thing. Younger people
Probably.
do everything on their phones with their apps, banking,
Yeah.
TV, whatever. People in their 70s, not so much, but they still need to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's why there could be a role for AI in there so that it's being done seamlessly without you even knowing about it. All you know is your bill is being managed and your comfort level is not really changing. There are a lot of things, but that's, AI is another piece of, getting everybody comfortable with that. But I think that could be where the potential role.
exactly. Thank you.
That's
Sure.
great.
Oh no, it's a tough question from Ed.
Yeah, Ed, go for it.
Hi, Jamie. Nice
Hi,
to
Ed.
see you, and thank
Good to
you for
see you.
spending your time on this. Um, the question I've had is we have a patchwork of utilities, gas, electric utilities around the state, and they aren't necessarily the same congruent territories. Would making those territories congruent allow the utilities themselves to manage the transition a lot easier? And if so, how can we help that happen? Right now, you have one or two munis who both do gas and electric, and they seem to operate pretty well. But
Yep.
we have this patchwork on top of the patchwork otherwise. So
It's definitely a lot easier if we had congruent service territories. So if you had National Grid providing both the electric and the gas, National Grid will sell more electricity, they're going to sell less gas. They're going to come to the regulators and they're going to say, well, we make less money because we don't have that infrastructure to deliver the gas. You can actually, do a rate making mechanism to, make them whole, so to speak, but their profits shouldn't suffer for doing the right things on behalf of customers. But we have a lot of service territories in the state. I mean, and probably, the, the the folks in probably the 10 towns I think that no new gas I think are a lot. It's Eversource Electric and National Grid natural gas. And yeah, it would be great to align those service territories so the combination utilities are serving both gas and electric to the same customers. So much easier. Actually, the Future of Heat Initiative, that's one of the research projects that we're working on is, what would the regulators don't really have much power the way exclusive service territories are designed and approved to be able to, sit National Grid and Eversource down and say, swap some customers so that you're serving both electric and gas to all these customers. It would be so much easier, but maybe there are some statutory changes that could be made that would give the DPU the authority to do that. Maybe there's existing authority for the DPU to send a signal that we would really like to see this and provide some incentives to do that because it really does make the job so much easier. One of the last cases I did before I joined the DPU, I was in private practice, and our client was the Sierra Club, and we intervened in a case out in Washington. It was a Vista Utilities in Spokane. And the only issue we were working on was this gas transition. What are you doing in order to implement this net zero by 2050 goal that the state of Washington has and that, frankly, Avista Utilities had? But they were a dual fuel utility. They sold both electric and gas. And so we entered into a settlement agreement in that case that basically encouraged Avista to sell more electricity, sell less gas, recognize that your profits are going to suffer slightly because you're not investing in that natural gas infrastructure, but you can include in there an incentive mechanism to make the utility whole and not penalize them for doing what's right in terms of the clean energy transition. But and you can do that when you have a combination utility where they have congruent service territories, and it's so much more challenging. But that's some of the stuff that the DPU is going to be looking at in the climate compliance plans and the electrification demonstration projects that are coming in. And I think it might really heighten the need. Does the DPU need more statutory authority to potentially help align these service territories, or its authority to provide incentives to encourage the utilities to do that?
Okay, I think Alan, you're up, and then Fran.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Jamie, one of the issues that we're all concerned with here is rising utility rates. Here at Elders Climate Action, some of us, maybe more of us than we want to acknowledge, are very concerned about elderly ratepayers and low-income ratepayers. I'm a former legal services attorney, and I worked on a number of utility issues when I was active. I've been following closely the National Consumer Law Center's, you know, annual cry about arrearage rates rising. And I'm wondering, are there better ways that we can address this issue of this rising arrearage rate? That's the number of people who are behind on their gas and electric
Sure.
bills and are threatened with shutoffs. And one of the things that I worry about is what happens if we have a recession? There is some concern about that, and we see a spike, a further spike, I should say, in the arrearage rates. How is that going to impact the entire financing system for our gas and electric companies? And lastly, are there better utility shutoff prohibitions that ought to be in place? Did you discuss that at the DPU?
That's a great question, Alan. And NCLC is just doing great work. The DPU, we started a proceeding in 2 years ago, basically, docket 2415, the energy burden docket. And that's where the DPU is looking at stratified income discounts. So the higher the income, the lower the discount, and then vice versa, to try to address that energy burden, have a target. What percentage of your income ought to go towards your energy bills, and then can we design rates in order to hit that target? And another piece of that proceeding is looking at shutoffs, basically utility collection practices, because I think there's some evidence out there that they don't really work all that well. There are better ways of trying to get there. So that proceeding is kicking along the DPU. I mean, National Grid already instituted 5 tiers in the discount rates in the order that was approved by the commission about a year and a half, or November of 2024, I guess. So it's already in place, but the DPU is looking at those things as part of the energy burden docket, not just the tiered discount rates, but also utility collection practices generally to figure out, do they make sense? And NCLC has just been doing. Roger Colton was one of the witnesses, I think, for NCLC in that docket. He's been working on this stuff for as long as he's 50 years. I mean, he was way back when we started looking at low income discount rates, probably in the early 90s, I think. Roger Colton was one of the trailblazers in terms of making that case that we all benefit by getting some money from customers, so don't shut them off, because making the case that a low income discount rate can be justified based on cost of service, because we're better off getting some money from customers than shutting them off. And Roger Colton did some real trailblazing work on that, and he's been doing great work for NCLC since then. I mean, they're challenging issues, and then that's the energy burden docket is, and then the legislature gave us the authority, I think, in 2024 to expand not just low income discounts, but also moderate income discounts, to recognize the fact that you kind of fall off a cliff. Most utilities were giving like a 34, 40% discount, but then as soon as you hit that threshold, then you got zero. So the idea is, let's have tiered discounts and then perhaps go a little bit higher into the moderate income category. So it's in front of the DPU in 2415.
Okay.
What happens, Jamie, if we have a recession and the arrearage rates skyrocket? And how does that impact the rest of the ratepayer base?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the point that Roger Colton was making way back in 30 years ago, was ratepayers, everybody bears these uncollected balances, basically. If you have uncollectibles, that's a cost of service that falls on the utility, and the utility recovers that from all customers. So the shareholders don't bear that. It's a cost of doing business. And so all ratepayers benefit the more that all ratepayers can pay their bill. So that's one thing in the energy burden docket, I think, making sure that those uncollectibles are as low as possible is just benefits everybody.
Okay. Jamie, do you have time for just these last two
Sure,
questions?
of course.
All right. And I think that, so Fran, and then Arnie, and then I think we're going to let Jamie go.
Thank you. So we have some elections coming up next fall, and working backwards, apparently last year, members of the House were hearing their phones ring off the hook about affordability. And now we've got an affordability bill from the governor. We've got one from Cusack, which is terrible for climate goals and for mass save. And if people look at their utility bills, they see breakouts for EVs, for solar, for things like that, and mass save, of course. And if people look at that and say, I'm not using those things, why should I pay for them? They don't see what they're paying for in the transmission part. They don't see the profit. They don't see the build out, excessive build out, et cetera. So, is there a simple message that can be sent out to members of the House and also to their constituents that would help to uncouple these climate provisions where they want to reduce the portfolio percentage of portfolio renewable portfolio percentage and moderate income reductions. How can you send a simple message that it's not those things that are causing the high price of energy?
That's a great question, Fran. I mean, I think the DPU is looking at that now. But I think more can be done in terms of explaining the bills, and I think there's been some efforts of maybe folks to try to categorize a whole bunch of things as public policy charges, and that's what's causing your bills to go up. And I think the utilities and probably the DPU and EEA and the DOER probably need to do a better job of explaining, like the electric vehicle thing. Well, why does that benefit me? I don't have an electric vehicle. Well, we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to decarbonize the transportation sector, and that surcharge goes to make sure that we're achieving those targets, which is going to produce climate benefits in the long run. And same thing with solar. I don't have a solar panel. Why is that on there? Well, because distributed energy resources makes the grid more resilient, and it should lower costs over time, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. But you got to tell that story better. But I think the DPU generally is looking at all those items on the bill. Can those be more grouped better? Maybe I think some things in terms of redesigning the rates so that they become less volatile, moving some things into fixed charges. That's some of the elements of the governor's bill is, I believe, Section 50 would require the DPU to try to figure out how you can minimize the number of rate changes and reduce the volatility of bills. I think the DPU is on that. But I think generally it really is sort of customer education, customer engagement. What do these charges represent? Because I think there's an effort to sort of trying to make the case those public policy charges are the things that are causing your bills to go up, and I think that's inaccurate. But I think we all need to do a better job of telling that story.
Okay, Arnie?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Jamie. Just a question on what you said earlier about the electric utilities and gas utilities have an incentive to build more and more capital projects. That's the way they earn profits, and it's up to the regulators and the DPU in particular to ensure they don't overbuild either on the gas side or the electric side. And what I hear from time to time is that the utilities seem to have the upper hand here. They have more resources to bring to bear, and the DPU more or less has to accept, in some cases, what utilities tell them needs to be built. Is there truth to that? And if there is, would it be a beneficial to the Commonwealth as a whole in terms of both our gas and electric rates to have the DPU more fully staffed or have better tools to bear to make sure that what the utilities say needs to be built actually does need to be built?
That's a great question, Arnie. I would say, I mean, having represented investor-owned utilities for 22 years and been, in rate proceedings with my cast of witnesses going against the commission staffs and interveners, there's no question the utilities have more resources. And I think in this CapEx bias that I mentioned, I mean, transmission distribution infrastructure is a good example because we'll see in the utilities, the electric sector modernization plans, building X number of new substations, upgrading a bunch of new substations. And then there's this whole other solution called non-wires alternatives that said, instead of the business as usual path of building more stuff and putting into rate base, trying to return on it, maybe we look at what's called virtual power plants, those things on the customer side of the meter, like batteries. I mean, get Tesla come out there and build a solar storage wall in your basement, the battery on your electric vehicle, the solar panel on your roof. The ability of a utility to dispatch those customer-sided technologies instead of building more stuff on the transmission distribution infrastructure, putting into the rate base. I mean, that's what we're battling against. And I've gone to technical sessions where with the utilities in the room and our staffs in the room and interveners in the room, and 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 part of it is, if you push the utilities, they've got some really talented, experienced, high-paid electrical engineers that'll just say, no, we looked at the non, because the DPU said in the orders, we expect the utilities to consider non-wires alternatives and demonstrate that you consider them before you make the traditional business as usual investment. You have to show us that you consider non-wires alternatives. And they'll say, okay, we did. And it doesn't work for the following reasons. And then interveners and the commission staff, then they have the burden to try to take that on and say, you built that substation. It has an asset utilization rate of about 63%, which means it's not being used 37% of the time. And maybe you wouldn't have needed to make that investment if you'd taken advantage of a bunch of batteries on the customer side of the meter or batteries in customers' electric vehicles, virtual power plants. But to make that case, to really take on the utility, that takes a lot of expertise. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It's very difficult. So yeah, the commission could always use um, more staff and staff with greater experience and qualifications. Because if you want to go head to head with these utility experts, the utility witnesses. And what I try to do with the DPU, and I think, we got three really good commissioners. The Commonwealth is in really good shape with Jeremy McDermott and Liz Anderson and Stacy Rubin. I think they're going to continue tackling these issues, but are there incentives when we think about the rate making process that will encourage the utility to look at that non-wires alternative, even though it might be the less profitable path because you don't get to build stuff and put it into rate base? Because I don't think the staff currently has the resources to really do a prudence review, because right now the regulator down the road will say, well, there was a lower cost solution that you didn't pursue, and now we're going to disallow that investment. That means you got to go through that prudence review and point out all the things the utility did wrong in making that traditional investment instead of the non-wires alternative. That's very, very resource intensive, and it requires expertise on our side of the table, when you're going up against the utilities. But are there incentives that we can put in as a matter of rate making to sort of level that, to deal with that CapEx bias, make the utility indifferent between the capital investment solution versus the operating expense solution, that they're indifferent in terms of their profitability, and let's pursue the lowest cost path for customers, because I think that's a better use of the precious resources of the DPU is trying to figure out, because then the regulators don't have to look as close. We've aligned the incentives, and we're letting the utility do its business and try to reward them for helping hold down costs for customers. But it's very challenging, and that information asymmetry, we call it, and it's basically resource asymmetry. It's definitely there, and that's why the more well-funded interveners we can have in cases, so it's not just left up to the DPU staff, but CLF, the Environmental League of Massachusetts, some of the other, I'm sorry, yeah, the some of those other interveners, that if they can participate in the Acadia Center is another one, the folks that can help make that case, because I've seen those technical sessions where you have the utilities saying, here's what we want to do, and you try to bring in the expert from the other side to challenge that, and you really need to have, you're going head to head with some very experienced utilities, and they say it's all about keeping the lights on, and the gas system, it's all about keeping the system safe, and you've got to have the capability, the technical capability on your side of the table to be able to take that on, and it's hard.
Yeah.
I have a really quick follow-on to that, and it's something I've been puzzling over for some time. Last session, there was quite a bit of discussion and finally a bill about siting and permitting. And we all know that to put in a transmission line or put in a substation can take years, get into a decade. Is the position of the utilities generally indifferent to that? Do they support actually a longer period of time to site and permit a substation or transmission line because they're just at the end of the day going to be collecting their rate of return? Can you shed some light on that and how the utilities feel about the length of time it takes to?
I think the utilities are very interested in streamlining the process. I mean, if we're going to have the build out necessary to achieve our decarbonization targets, both electrification of transportation and buildings, we've got to move a lot more electrons around, which means we've got to build more substations and transmission lines, and it's got to be built faster than it's been done in the past. I think the challenge that that Siting and Permitting Commission under Mike Judge, who did an amazing job herding all that whole process, but also doing it better in terms of public engagement and environmental justice communities, not overburdening communities that already have too much energy infrastructure in their neighborhoods. So it's doing it faster, but also doing it better. But I think there's the recognition which underlie that the passage of that Siting and Permitting bill is we need to do stuff faster in order to get the things necessary to accommodate the clean energy build out.
Great. So I think thank you for sticking around for a little extra time, Jamie. I think it time to move on. I really thank you for this opportunity to tap into this deep well of vast knowledge that you bring to the table, and
Thank you.
and the passion that we share. I think we have a lot of things to think about, and potentially some direction where we all as activists can make a difference. So I think we'll all be signing on to the Future of Heat initiative to kind of keep up with you guys are doing, and maybe have you back sometime soon again.
Sure. Glad to do
Thanks
it.
very much.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see everybody.